Welcome to Your Future Starts Now, the go-to podcast for extraordinary women who are ready to step into their next chapter with authentic confidence. I'm your host, Gia Lacqua, empowerment coach, motivational speaker, children's book author, and girl mom. Whether you're a corporate powerhouse or an entrepreneur, this show is designed for you. Your Future Starts Now is more than just a podcast. It's a movement towards rewriting the rules of success for high-achieving women. Are you ready to get unstuck and step into your next chapter? If so, you're exactly where you need to be. Your future starts now. Welcome to Your Future Starts Now. I'm your host, Gia Lacqua. Thanks for tuning in. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Nekeshia Hammond to the show. Dr. Nekeshia is a distinguished psychologist, executive coach, and founder of Hammond Psychology and Associates. She's known for her expertise in mental health, burnout prevention, and leadership development, and she's an international speaker and best-selling author. Dr. Hammond's insights have been featured on NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, and Essence Magazine, as well as platforms like Corporate Council Women of Color and TEDx, focusing on mental wellness and leadership balance. Dr. Nekeshia, welcome to the show. So excited to chat with you today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here as well.
So tell us a little bit about your background, just so our listeners can get to know you a little bit better, and what led you to the work that you're doing today.
Yeah. So a little bit more about me. I grew up in Orlando, Florida, home of Disney World. I grew up in a single parent home. It was at that time myself and my brother and my mom growing up, learned unfortunately really quickly how to not have self-care, but instead how to run myself into the ground. Everything was just very go, go, go mentality, not having a lot of conversations that I recall as a child about mental health and wellness and self-care. So fast forward, 15 years ago, I started a psychology practice, and I'm still there a part of the time doing evaluations, psychological evaluations. And the other part of the time, I have been spending more in the community with different organizations and corporations teaching burnout prevention and self-care, because there's a lot that we can do to prevent ourselves from falling apart when we learn how to appropriately take care of ourselves.
I love that. And such important topics. I mean, it certainly is not new, but it's also still very much needed, especially for our audience of high achieving women. So it sounds like you have some personal experience. I would love to know what inspired you to focus on burnout prevention and stress management and work-life balance.
Yeah. And it really comes from personal and professional experience. So personally, I've definitely hit burnout. In the past, I didn't quite understand like I do today about how important it is for us to be focusing on our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual health. So really from a personal lens, because I know what that's like, because I know what it's like to just run yourself into the ground, work, try to be super wife, super mom, super, business owner or employer, whatever it is, and try to juggle all that unsuccessfully. I now have just more of a heart to help people manage that more appropriately. I certainly don't have a perfect life by any means, but I am in a better space now to live a healthier life. So that's more on the personal side. And on the professional side, what happened was after COVID in 2020, a lot of the speaking engagements I was getting was really like, please help us deal with the stress, because obviously it was a very stressful time, especially with corporate, especially with businesses, especially in the professional realm. Everything sort of fell apart globally. So I started working with a lot more organizations of like, how do we work on work-life integration? How do we make ourselves healthier? So that's led me to today, of course, and I'm still doing the work, and I absolutely love it. And I'm grateful to be in these spaces.
Amazing. And you talk in the work that you do, I know that you talk about holistic self-care. So I would love to understand a little bit more about what that means and any advice you have for listeners and how they can incorporate that into their lives.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I think of holistic self-care, I really think of it as, if you were to ask yourself, I always say people should ask themselves 3 questions often, and I'll get to those 3 questions in a moment, but really thinking about physically, spiritually, emotionally, and mentally, because oftentimes when we think about self-care, it might only be in one area,
Yeah.
but then we're neglecting the rest of ourselves, which is very problematic. So sometimes we go really hard and like, I want to lose weight, or I want to eat better, or I want to exercise, which are important things, but that's just one aspect. But like, how are you doing in the other parts of your life and who you are? So three questions I always encourage people to ask themselves, preferably once a week, is number one is, how am I doing? Because it is so easy, especially as women, it's so easy to check in on everyone else, all of the things that we hear from our friends and our family and maybe whomever else may live in your household. Like, it's easy to get caught up in that and then start to neglect ourselves. But it's important that you also are saying to yourself, how am I doing? And be honest with your answer. And the second question I always recommend people ask is, what do I need? So spiritually, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, what do you need? Because what you need today is not the same as what you needed 5 or 10 years ago. And it won't be what you need. It might not necessarily be what you need in the future, because our needs change, of course. So really diving into like, what do you need? And then the third question is, what step can I take today to start to improve my life in whatever the areas of needs that you identified?
Yep.
But that's just a practice, and it's something I've definitely done as well, to just pivot, make some adjustments, continue to work on thriving and continue to work on work-life balance. But as you mentioned, it's so important when we think about holistic self-care to do those type of things.
Those are super powerful questions. I love that advice. And I agree. I mean, I think it's easy to get caught up in one facet, right, of your well-being and not focus on the others. So I love the question of, how am I doing? What do I need? And what's one step I can take today? And doing that on a regular basis, because I think we don't do that enough.
No.
And it's very rare that somebody stops us and says, how are you doing? Like, how are you really doing?
Exactly.
Right. And what do you need right now?
Yes.
So I think that's great advice. You know, one thing I see as a theme in the women that I work with, and I had personal experience with as well, when I went through my bout of burnout and as having heart palpitations and just, you know, similarly ran myself into the ground.
Yeah.
There was a huge mindset shift for me that had to happen, right? And there was some soul searching that had to happen. But one of the things that I see is very common, and I would love your take on it, is the term self-care used to make me gag.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I see it so often that a lot of women have this like visceral allergic reaction to the term. And which sometimes can be a barrier in of itself, besides the other barriers of making time and, you know, et cetera. So I would love your take on, is there a reframe we can offer? Like, what's your take on how do we think about self-care so that it's not such a turnoff?
Yeah, no, and I totally get it. Especially being in the field, it's such a buzzword now. We see it everywhere. It's all over social media.
Sure.
And it can be exhausting, like just to be like, what? Fit in more self-care? Like, are you,
one
you know,
more
are you
thing
crazy?
to do,
Like,
right?
Yeah. One more thing. And I will admit, transparently, I used to be guilty of that as well a while back. Like, I was like, self-care, I don't have time for that. Like, it's things that we tell ourselves, which are not true. But to your point, something that hopefully can be helpful to people listening to this is that if you're a person that thinks of self-care as selfish, just know that when you work on yourself, it's honestly not just for you, it's also for the people around you as well. So one of my huge motivators, my son is now 12, but after I discovered the life of a newborn, which was crazy and hectic and not what I expected. It was just a lot. Like, this little baby just demanded so much of our time and attention. But nonetheless, I was like, you know what? I am really motivated to be the best mom that I can be to him. But a couple years in, I definitely learned at the rate I was going, I could not show up for him the way I could, being burnt out, overwhelmed, frazzled all the time. Like, that can't work best when you live in that world. And it may not be a child, it may be whomever else around you. So sometimes we can incorporate self-care, again, of course, for us to show up powerfully for ourselves, but also in the workplace, also in whatever roles you have in the community, with friends, with family. Like, let's also hopefully work on bringing a better version of ourselves to other people. And also, I will say, because again, I used to be in the mindset that I didn't have time to
Mm-hmm.
add something else to my to-do list. But what I started with many years ago is something what I call take a minute, and essentially taking a minimum of 60 seconds a day, which all of us have that time. We may not have hours and hours of time, but 60 seconds a day to just take a pause and take a reset and a recharge. And it really helps to retrain your brain to understand that you deserve self-care, you deserve to be emotionally happy, you deserve to have joy in your life, you deserve all those things. But again, it's a mindset training tool that you can use, like literally take a minute in the way that works best for you each day.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and I would agree. And similarly, when we struggle to find that work-life balance or integration, a lot of us, especially working moms, struggle with the guilt.
Yes.
Is there anything else you would offer for those of us who feel guilty that when we're taking time for ourselves, we're not actively working, we're not spending time with our kids, we're not doing all the things we quote unquote should be doing?
Yeah, that is like super common. I've heard that many, many, many a times. And again, not saying times are perfect now, but I do recall also having, like I said, that guilt.
Yeah.
But one of the things about self-care, if you're having a lot of guilt and you're really struggling to do your own solo work, if you will, you can start out. There's also family versions of self-care as well. Like I mean, it's more or less, how do you work on becoming a better version of who you are and becoming healthier in the different areas of your life? So at first, if you need to be like, you know what, for whatever reason, have a demanding career, whatever it is, let me spend this time, this family time, let's say, if you're a working mom, and do some type of self-care activity with the kids, that counts too. Ideally, your goal is to find the time. I know it's hard, but it's easy. It gets easier, but to find the time also for yourself, even if it's small amounts of time. Taking a minute a day is not going to take away from the time with your kids, for example. So again, not hours and hours necessarily, but like a minute a day, but it's something for you. But again, when it comes to changing your behavior and that sort of thing, it's in the field of psychology, we call it shaping, but it's starting with what you're comfortable with and slowly making that progress over time. But remembering a little bit goes really far when it comes to training your brain and taking that mental break that you need.
Yeah, so important. And I love the suggestion of maybe not only starting small, but maybe doing something with the kids or
Yeah.
as a family, right? Find a puppy yoga place or whatever
Yeah.
that might look
Exactly.
like for you, right? Just to start small and then start getting into that habit and then sort of going from there.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And I think that, for me personally, I know one of the other things that was really hard for me is, we can ask people to find the time. And then of course it's, we're busy, we don't have time. And you and I, we and our listeners now know that that's really an excuse. We have to make the time. We have to create the time. We have to create that space. But yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that was really hard for me was boundaries. So I would love to know from your perspective, what role does boundary setting, which is also sort of, and quote unquote, used to be an ugly word for me.
Yeah.
What role does boundary setting play when it comes to self-care and balance?
Yeah, it's so huge. And I know that's another buzz term that we hear about setting your boundaries, but I'm not saying it's the easiest thing to
Yeah.
do. Well, actually, let me take that back. It's easy to set the boundaries, but sometimes it's hard to keep them, especially if you have other people pushing your boundaries. That can be difficult. But nonetheless, taking the first step of setting the boundaries, whatever that looks like. So if there's I know a lot of parents that'll say after a certain amount of time or after a certain time of the day, they don't answer the phone or they don't do emails or do work related things. If that works for you, that's an example of a boundary. Or the certain amount of time that you take to respond to someone. I just saw something that's funny this week on Instagram that was like, you don't have to immediately text someone back when they text you. Like, we don't have to be in this urgency culture. Like, you can take some time to respond to people because most things aren't that urgent. But again, it's just setting the boundaries. It's doing your best to keep them and understanding how that works for your mental health. And not everybody's going to be happy with the boundaries you set. Unfortunately, not everyone around you would be necessarily happy with them, but it's what is it that's best for you and your mental health and wellness.
Yeah. And it's so true, especially when they're new boundaries and you haven't set them before. They're new to you, and then they're also new to other people. So recognizing that it's a process and probably will take some time. It's an adjustment.
It does. It does. It takes time. Yes, for sure.
But I love what you just said about the urgency culture. I think that is also so true because we're so hyper connected, and it is so hard to turn off and disconnect. And we do have this sense of everything needs to be responded to and addressed right away, whether it's because you don't want to have 100 emails sitting in your email box, or you think the people who are texting you need an answer right away. I think, again, that's also sort of, how do we set boundaries around that? How do we shift our mindset around the need to be hyper responsive to?
Yeah. And it really is. I mean, I've seen, like, there's when it comes to boundaries, it really is what works best for you. So I know, like, it's funny, I've seen on, I won't say their names, but I've seen on some colleagues' emails, like literally at the bottom of their email in their signature line, they're like, I am not responding after 7 p.m. and between these hours, and I'm not responding on the weekend. Like, there's a whole thing. And I was like, wow, okay. Like, because it's very clear, like, that's what they're doing. I know a lot of people put their phones on do not disturb or not. So it's really, where is it for you that can bring more peace into your life? And that's realistic and feasible for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the other side of that, I've also seen leaders who are now putting sort of a note at the bottom of their signature that, I'm responding to you, or I'm writing to you at the time that works best for me, but I don't expect you to respond off hours, right? You respond at the time that is best for you, which I think is also so thoughtful, giving other people that permission to not have to respond right away, which I think is also super helpful. So you talk about burnout in your book. I would love to learn a little bit more about your book, Mindset Training, Conquer Your Mind, and the rest will follow. Would you be willing to share maybe some tips, tools, any advice that's coming out of your book around, self-care and burnout prevention?
Yeah, for sure. So essentially the book is divided into those 4 areas of your self-care: emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically, with some specific strategies to start to implement. One of my favorite things when I think about self-care, when I think about mindfulness, because that's also a buzz term that we hear a lot, trying to do your best to live in the present moment, which is really hard when you have a lot on your to-do list and you're juggling a lot. But it also starts with the things that you're already currently doing, working on adjusting your mindset to stay in that moment. And that could be like brushing your teeth in the morning, like when you're in the shower, when you're driving, like those times you have to train your brain to do it. But when you really stop to be in the present moment of what you're doing, even if it's a minute or two, it really helps to reset yourself mentally and also physically. So thankfully, we've been hearing a lot lately, I feel like, on social media and in the news about our nervous systems and how when you're too much on the go and you're in this fight or flight mode, it's not healthy to be in that place all the time. So though, when you really think about how can you physically lower your blood pressure, get your heart rate, more stable, and take some deep breaths, that also helps you physically as well. So that's just a couple of examples, of course, but there's a lot of tools and a lot of strategies that you can start to implement. And I really wanted to share different ones because I want people to do what works best for them.
I love that. Yeah. And it's true because it's not a one size fits all. And
no, not at all.
Figuring out what works for you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So true. So we talked about, I think oftentimes we hear about physical wellness, we hear about emotional health, we hear about mental health, but I would love to tap into and dig in with you a little bit more about the role of spirituality. And What, in your opinion, role does that play in, fostering resilience and maintaining emotional balance?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So when it comes to spirituality, it can be tied to your religious beliefs or not. So it's not tied to one religion or another. It's more of a deeper sense of connection to your purpose, to a higher power, if that makes sense to you, universe, whatever it is you want to call it. But that aspect of growing your faith, your spirituality, your connection, your purpose can also really, really help you. There's tons of studies on it, but can really help to get you through some hard times, and prevent burnout. Because again, when the job gets more demanding,
Yeah.
when you're trying to get that next promotion, when you're trying to juggle the kids or whatever it is that's bringing you so much stress, clinging to your sense of purpose, if you will, and your sense of connection with others can really help to get you through.
Mm-hmm. And if somebody isn't necessarily grounded in a particular faith or necessarily consider themselves spiritual, what
Mhm.
advice would you have for them in terms of how to start?
Yeah. So and again, because self care is for everyone, no matter your religion. So, connecting with nature that's one of my favorite things to do, actually. But it is something that just can help you to be more grounded and
Mhm.
more focused, especially with spiritual growth. So, whatever that piece of nature looks like for you, I live in Florida and love my sunshine. So, I don't necessarily love the snow, but I know some people do. But I mean, if it's, being in the snow, or if it's being at a beach or a lake, mountains, like wherever it is outside, walking through a park, like spending that time
Mhm.
and just being more connected to something larger than yourself, if you will, and just understanding, being in reflection with your sense of purpose and meaning for your life, that can be something that's helpful as well.
Love that. Such great advice.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about success and redefining success on this podcast. So I would love to know what your definition of success is for yourself and sort of how that definition may have evolved for you over time.
Ooh, that's a great question. Definition of success, man. When I think of success, I think of it very multidimensional.
Mhm.
So for me personally, success is how am I doing in all the areas, physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and also with my family, also with friends, also with community. I'm very, very big on giving back, helping others. Like, am I doing the best that I can to serve and help people around me? So yeah, that's what success looks like for me, as well, of course, business as well. So
Mhm.
definitely a multi-dimensional piece.
Mhm. Yeah, it's important. The multidimensional piece is important because I think it is, again, very easy to get fixated on one aspect, like
Yes.
career,
Yes.
which can lead us down that burnout path pretty quickly, right?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's important that, over time we evaluate what that means because it can change and evolve and shift. And, really figuring out again what that means to us, I think is super important.
Yeah.
Is there something that you want our listeners to consider doing differently or changing after listening to today's episode?
Yeah. I would say my hope is that people listening to this really work on making yourself your number one priority. So it doesn't mean you're selfish. It does mean that you're working on showing up more powerfully for yourself and for the people around you. Which one of the ways to do that is to really be in a state of reflection and practice holistic self care, to work on to continue thriving in your life.
Great. Great advice. Dr. Nekeshia, where can our listeners learn more about you and your books and the work that you do?
Yeah, the best place to find me is on my website. It's drnekeshiahammond.com, DRNEKESHIA, Hammond.com.
Perfect. I want to thank you so much for being here, for sharing your insights and expertise. Really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And of course, you can visit my website at gialacqua.com, reach out on Instagram at gialacqua, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. This is Gia signing off with gratitude for your time and energy. Our mic drops, but the movement continues. Until next time, your next chapter is waiting. Take care.
That concludes another empowering episode of Your Future Starts Now. Before we wrap up, I want to thank this incredible community of high-achieving women. Your energy, resilience, and commitment to growth are the driving force behind what we do. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate it, leave a review, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Your feedback fuels our mission to empower high-achieving women just like you. And of course, share Your Future Starts Now with the extraordinary women in your life who are also on a journey of healing and empowerment. Connect with us on social media, share your thoughts, let us know what topics you'd like to explore in future episodes. Stay connected on Instagram at Gia Lacqua. I encourage you to carry the energy of this conversation into your day and keep on supporting the incredible women around you. Until next time, remember, your next chapter is waiting.